Mercedes were supposed to get slower. The FIA changed the checks. The loophole was supposed to be closed. Rivals believed the secret advantage was finally gone. Then Kimi Antonelli hit the line in Monaco. Pole position. By 43 thousandths of a second. And suddenly, the whole paddock had the same terrifying thought. What if Mercedes were not exposed at all? What if the FIA only removed the trick everyone could see, while the real advantage stayed hidden inside the car? Because this is bigger than one lap. Mercedes had already been watched over a hot engine compression controversy, a front wing investigation, and a banned qualifying power exploit. 3 separate questions. 1 disturbing pattern. They keep finding speed where the rules are hardest to police. And now, after Antonelli's Monaco pole, the FIA clampdown may not be the end of the story. It may be the proof that Mercedes are even further ahead than anyone wanted to admit. Subscribe to the channel. To understand why Antonelli's Monaco pole triggered such a serious reaction, you have to start with one uncomfortable truth. Mercedes did not arrive in Monaco as just another fast team. They arrived as the team everyone was already watching. Not casually. Not with curiosity. With suspicion. Because before Antonelli ever crossed the line for that pole lap, Mercedes had already become the biggest technical question in Formula 1. Their car was winning. Their drivers were leading. Their pace was too consistent, too complete, too difficult to explain with one simple answer. And when a Formula 1 car becomes difficult to explain, rivals do not assume magic. They start looking for the mechanism. That is where the pressure began. The new era of Formula 1 had changed the game. The power units were now built around a much heavier balance between combustion and electrical energy. In simple words, the engine was no longer just about burning fuel and going fast. It was about managing energy, heat, timing, and power delivery with extreme precision. And Mercedes appeared to understand that new world before everyone else. Kimi Antonelli was not just having a strong season. He was leading the Drivers' Championship. George Russell was sitting behind him in second. Mercedes were controlling the Constructors' Championship, and the rest of the grid was being forced to chase a car that looked strong everywhere. That is the part that made rivals nervous. A car can be strong at one circuit because the track suits it. A driver can have one great weekend because everything comes together. But Mercedes were not showing a one-race flash. They were building a pattern. And patterns are dangerous. Because a pattern means the advantage is not random. It means there is something inside the car, inside the team, or inside the interpretation of the rules, that is repeating itself every time the stopwatch starts. The first place rivals looked was the engine. That makes sense. In a new regulation era, the power unit is where huge gains can hide. And with the new balance between combustion and electrical power, a small discovery could become a massive advantage. The controversy centered on something called compression ratio. That sounds complicated, but the idea is simple. Inside the engine, air and fuel are squeezed before they burn. The tighter that mixture is squeezed, the more force the engine can produce when it ignites. Imagine pressing down on a spring. If you press lightly, it barely jumps back. If you press harder, it snaps back with more force. That is why the rule mattered. Formula 1 set a maximum compression ratio of 16:1. That was supposed to limit how much the teams could squeeze that mixture and turn it into power. But the real controversy was not only the number. It was the test. According to the source material, the rule was originally checked when the engine was cold, sitting in the pit lane, at ambient temperature. On paper, that sounds clean. The car is stopped. The conditions are controlled. The officials can measure what they need to measure. But racing does not happen in those conditions. A Formula 1 engine does not win races while resting in the garage. It wins races when it is hot. Violently hot. Alive with pressure, vibration, and stress. When metal expands. When tiny gaps change. When components behave differently from how they behaved before the car left the pit lane. And that was the alleged opening. Mercedes were believed to have found a way for the engine to measure legally when cold, but behave differently once it reached full operating temperature. In the garage, it could appear inside the limit. On track, under heat, rivals suspected it could effectively operate beyond the spirit of that limit. That is why the word loophole became so powerful. Because a loophole is not always a broken rule. Sometimes it is a rule that was not prepared for the smartest possible reading. And that is what makes Formula 1 so ruthless. The best teams do not only ask, what does the rule say? They ask, how is the rule measured? When is it measured? Under what conditions? What happens between the test and the race? Those questions can decide championships. And Mercedes had allegedly found one of the most valuable gaps of the new era. The suggested advantage was up to 0.3 of a second per lap. 0.3. That number matters because in Formula 1, 0.3 is not a small improvement. It is a different race. It can turn a second-row car into a pole contender. It can protect tires because the driver does not have to overpush. It can change strategy because track position becomes easier to hold. It can make the whole team look calmer than it really is. And at Monaco, Antonelli's pole margin was only 43 thousandths. Less than a blink. So when people heard that the earlier Mercedes advantage may have been worth several times more than the Monaco pole margin, the suspicion became impossible to ignore. But here is where the story sharpens. The FIA had already responded. The governing body moved to close the gap by changing the way the engine would be assessed. Instead of relying only on cold measurements, the new enforcement would check the engine at a representative operating temperature of 130 degrees Celsius. In plain English, the FIA stopped asking what the engine looked like while sitting still. It started asking what the engine became when it was working. That was the major clampdown. That was supposed to be the moment the championship changed. Because if Mercedes had been too fast because of this controversial thermal behavior, then checking the engine hot should have taken that advantage away. Monaco became the test case. The place where the rest of the paddock expected to finally see the real Mercedes. Not the suspected Mercedes. Not the loophole Mercedes. The real Mercedes. And that is why the pole caused such a shock. Because Mercedes were supposed to be exposed. Instead, Antonelli delivered. On a circuit where there is almost no room for excuses, where every mistake touches a wall, where power matters less than confidence, balance, and precision, the Mercedes still looked alive in his hands. That lap did not calm the paddock down. It made the paddock more nervous. Because if the clampdown had removed the obvious trick and Mercedes were still fast enough for pole, then maybe the obvious trick was never the full story. Maybe it was only one piece. That is the fear now. Not that Mercedes found a loophole. But that Mercedes found a whole way of thinking. A way to build performance from the spaces between the rules. A way to combine engine behavior, energy delivery, aerodynamics, and driver confidence into something that cannot be removed with one technical correction. And that is far more dangerous for the rest of the grid. Because a loophole can be closed. A directive can be written. A test can be changed. But if the advantage is spread through the entire car, then rivals are not chasing one trick anymore. They are chasing an entire system. That is what Antonelli's Monaco pole really triggered. Not celebration. Not only controversy. A new fear that Mercedes may still be ahead, even after the FIA took away the advantage everyone thought mattered most. But the engine clampdown was only the beginning. Because once the FIA started looking more closely at Mercedes, the entire car began to feel different to the rest of the paddock. Not because one official finding proved everything. It did not. But because every strange detail now looked connected to a bigger pattern. And in Formula One, patterns are what make rivals nervous. One clever interpretation can be dismissed as innovation. Two unusual systems can be explained as coincidence. But when a dominant team keeps appearing near the limit, in different parts of the car, at different races, under different rules, the question changes. It is no longer, what did they find? It becomes, how many things have they found? That is why the front wing story mattered. On paper, it was separate from the engine controversy. The compression issue was about heat and power. The front wing was about airflow and movement. But on track, those things are never truly separate. A Formula One car is not a collection of isolated parts. It is a chain reaction. The engine changes the speed. The speed changes the air. The air changes the pressure on the wing. The wing changes the balance. The balance changes the tires. The tires change the confidence of the driver. And confidence is where lap time becomes dangerous. During the Chinese Grand Prix weekend, rival teams noticed unusual behavior on the Mercedes W16's front wing. The concern was that the flaps appeared to remain in an intermediate position under braking, not fully where rivals expected them to be, and not closing in the way the rules demanded. That may sound like a tiny technical detail. But it is not tiny when a driver is arriving at a corner with the car loaded, the brakes screaming, and the front tires being asked to grip at the exact moment the rear is going light. The front wing is the first part of the car to meet the air. It decides how the air is guided around everything behind it. Think of it like opening the first door in a crowded hallway. If that first door opens at a different angle, everyone behind it has to move differently. The entire flow changes because the first movement changed. That is what the front wing does. It shapes the air before the rest of the car ever gets a chance to use it. So if that wing behaves differently under braking, it can change how stable the car feels when the driver needs trust the most. And this is where Antonelli comes back into the story. Because Monaco is not only about having speed. It is about believing the car will stay with you when every instinct tells you to leave a margin. Antonelli did not look like a driver leaving a margin. He looked committed. He looked calm. He looked like the car was giving him something other drivers did not have. That does not mean the front wing was illegal. The FIA investigated the concern and cleared Mercedes. According to the source material, the explanation was not deliberate software manipulation. It was linked to insufficient hydraulic pressure, a design miscalculation that affected how the wing closed under certain air loads. No penalty followed. But here is the part that keeps the story alive. A clearance does not erase the fact that rivals had reason to look. Mercedes were not punished, but they were inspected. The system was not declared illegal, but it was unusual enough to become a talking point. And when a team is already under pressure for one controversial interpretation, even a cleared investigation adds weight to the feeling that the car is operating in uncomfortable territory. That is how suspicion builds. Not always through one smoking gun. Sometimes it builds through accumulation. A hot engine question here. A front wing question there. A strange qualifying power method after that. Each one can be explained on its own. But together, they create a feeling that Mercedes are not just pushing the rules. They are studying the shape of the rules better than anyone else. And then came the most alarming layer. The hybrid deployment controversy. This one mattered because it was not only about performance. It became about safety. Under the new rules, cars had to reduce electrical energy deployment as they approached the timing line on a qualifying lap. In simple terms, the car could not just keep releasing maximum electrical power all the way to the end without a controlled reduction. Everyone had to follow the same power fade. At least, that was the intention. But Mercedes and Red Bull reportedly discovered a way to use an emergency shutdown function linked to the hybrid system. This feature existed for protection, for genuine problems, for moments when a system needed to be saved before damage became worse. The controversy was that it could be used intentionally at the end of a qualifying lap, allowing the car to avoid the normal reduction of electrical power for longer. That is the kind of idea Formula One engineers dream about, and regulators hate. Because it sits in a strange place. The function exists. The software exists. The car can do it. But was it created to be used as a planned performance shortcut? That is the uncomfortable question. Imagine a road where every driver has to slow down before the finish line. Then one driver realizes the emergency lane lets him stay faster for longer. The emergency lane is real. The car is still on the road. But everyone understands that something about the spirit of the rule has been twisted. And then the consequences became visible. At the Japanese Grand Prix, Antonelli and Verstappen both suffered dangerous power losses through corners. They were left crawling in high-speed sections while other cars approached at full pace. Alexander Albon was also affected by complications connected to the same kind of system. Suddenly, this was no longer a clever qualifying trick whispered about by engineers. It was a risk drivers could feel. A slow car in the wrong place can become terrifying. The driver behind may not expect it. The closing speed can rise instantly. And in a sport where reactions are measured in fractions of a second, confusion can become danger before anyone has time to understand what happened. Ferrari raised safety concerns. The FIA responded with a technical directive. Emergency shutdowns had to be used only for legitimate emergencies. The system could not be used as a systematic performance tool. And Antonelli himself admitted the trick was not safe, while supporting the ban from a driver's safety point of view. That detail is important. Because drivers do not easily give up lap time. They want speed. They protect speed. They accept pressure and discomfort if it makes the car faster. So when a driver says a performance trick is not safe, it tells you the debate has moved from the engineering office to the cockpit. Now connect the three layers. The engine controversy was about a car changing with temperature. The front wing concern was about a part behaving unusually under load. The hybrid trick was about an emergency system being used for performance timing. Different systems. Same theme. Mercedes kept appearing in places where the rules were hardest to police. And that is why Antonelli's Monaco pole caused such a strong reaction after the FIA clampdown. Because the FIA had already acted. It had changed the hot engine checks. It had restricted the emergency shutdown trick. It had investigated the front wing concern. It had started closing doors. But Mercedes still found pole. That is the part rivals cannot ignore. Because if one door closes and the car remains at the front, the field has to ask whether there are more doors hidden in the same wall. Maybe the engine loophole helped. Maybe the hybrid trick helped. Maybe the front wing concern meant less than rivals feared. But Monaco suggested something bigger. Mercedes were not built around one controversial idea. They may have been built around a philosophy of total exploitation. Not cheating in the simple, cartoon version of the word. Something more complicated. Finding every gray area. Understanding every test. Reading every rule not only for what it says, but for what it fails to say. building performance into the spaces that regulators only notice after someone proves they matter. That is the battle now. The FIA is not just trying to police one Mercedes part. It is trying to keep control of a regulation era that may already be moving faster than its own enforcement systems. And Mercedes, whether rivals like it or not, have forced that confrontation. Because Antonelli's Monaco pole did not calm the technical storm. It made the storm more serious. It told the paddock that even after the clampdown, even after the questions, even after the directives, the Mercedes W17 could still deliver when the whole world expected it to lose its edge. And that means the next stage of this story is not about whether Mercedes were too fast before. It is about whether anyone can prove why they are still too fast now.